Hello, hello, and welcome to Art Pop Talk. I'm Bianca.
And I'm Gianna. Alexa, play Twinkle Song from Miley and Her Dead Pets.
What does it mean? What does it mean? Well, today, we'll tell you what it means. It means that we are talking all about taxidermy, a complex act of animal preservation used for art, trophies, history, and natural science.
Continuing our ARTloween series, we are joined by Foster W. Krupp, a museum studies major, to talk about this history, but also the creep factor that taxidermy carries in its many different environments.
This episode is gonna get you fucking fucked up. So let's Art Pop talk about taxidermy.
Hey guys, hey Bianca.
Yo, yo, yo.
Yo, yo, yo. So I need everyone to know, or at least I hope that some of the Art Pop tarts know, that Fucking Fucked Up is a song on Miley's album. And I know you love it when I explain my jokes, but that's as witty as I could try to be writing this intro.
You know, it was good. I'm here for it. I want to get fucked up by some museum talk.
Well, I was trying to find different titles, and I was going to be like, Karen, don't be sad. Let's Art Pop talk. I don't know. And honestly, Bianca, I don't know if you noticed this, but I stopped writing captions for my Instagram posts because truly, I'm just, I'm not a witty person. I would love to be a witty person, but
I think you're so witty.
I have to save my wittiness up for these intros now. I have no more wittiness to give to my own personal Instagram, which I really don't even give a shit about these days anyway, so I've just stopped writing Instagram captions because I really want to put the content where it's useful.
Well, you're doing a good job because I feel like every time you post something for our Pop Talk, I'm like, oh, that's funny. I would have never fucking thought of that. I'm always just here is today's episode.
Well, can I tell you what I was going to write for our caption today when I posted the resources, but I didn't because... Well, because, especially with today's content, before we get into our discussion with Foster, I just need you all to know that taxidermy is such a large part of my museum trauma. I really have some, I'm really fucking fucked up because of taxidermy.
Wait, that could be the title of the episode.
I am fucked up. I am not doing well. It really is true. And so I was going to be check out these images that Foster shared with us because I'm too scared to look up my own images. But I felt as though I wanted you guys to listen to the episode before I, gave you a little taste of my museum trauma.
Yeah, that's good. We can talk about that. I actually, whenever we were talking with Foster, whenever we did the recording, afterwards, we were saying we may need to do a call out and have you guys submit stories about your museum trauma because I feel like there's some good ones. Foster had good ones. Gianna, you have good ones. I have some, the dinosaur museum one. I'll never forget it.
Do you want to tell them about the dinosaur museum one now, or do we want to wait till after art news?
I feel like we should wait for the museum trauma episode. I want to save it for the episode entirely.
Save it all up. Oh, God.
Yeah. So one episode of just trauma.
How is that different from any other episode we do, I suppose?
Well, this one is a little touchy for you.
Yeah, this one is just, I won't, I guess if we're going to do this episode, which it sounds like, we should do, we'll take a poll later. I won't tell the whole story, but I'll just say, if any of the tarts have been to Willow Rock, if you know what that is.
In Oklahoma.
It's a historical site here, and it fucking sucks. That's all I'm going to say.
If you're afraid of taxidermy, like Gianna is,
don't go.
Don't go.
Bianca, I was also so pissed because Mom came over to give me some furniture yesterday, and she asked me what the episode was going to be about, and I said it was going to be on taxidermy, and she was like, oh, are you going to be okay? And I said, no, I'm not going to be okay. And we had this whole conversation where we had to go down memory lane. And I was like, how did you not know that's the only thing Willow Rock has to offer? And she was like, well, I don't know. They have other things. I said, no, they don't. She was like,
I do remember eating a hot dog there.
She said they have a doll collection. They have an airplane collection. I said, oh, really? Do they? Because all I remember is the big giant elephant head on the wall. Like, thank you for
actually, that's all I
me.
remember too, and the hot dog. I remember definitely eating a hot dog.
Ugh, I remember like a taxidermy bison that they turned into a trash can. Do you remember that? You would put the trash, like, it was like a suction thing. It was like in its mouth, and then it would like take it away. Do you remember that?
No.
I'm like,
No,
that's disgusting. So freaking don't go to Willow Rock.
We're not advocating for
Not advocating. You're gonna be okay. You know what? I'm not.
Well, should we switch it up and get into art news a little bit? Give you a little breather.
Yeah, we should. Sorry, guys. For today's art news. I thought it would be fun to piggyback off of our episode from last week and talk about the continuation of a beloved cult classic series, which is Chucky. So Chucky has come back with the same charm and from the original creator.
Charm?
Yeah, have you
Same charm? I've never seen Chucky.
I'll get into it a little bit. I've never seen, like, I haven't seen a lot of the movies. I haven't seen Chucky all the way through, but it's, like, humorous and, like, very, like, witty, and, like, Chucky's kind of like a beloved character. It's interesting. So the creator, Don Mancini, is a part of this new series, which is taking form in this episodic format. So critics say that the series stays very true to the spirit of the movies, putting the focus on the young cast at its core while also making room for some familiar folks from Chucky's past. Also including a detailed backstory this time of Charles Lee Ray as Chucky was known before he used black magic to transfer his dying spirit into a doll. So one of the reasons Chucky is a cult classic is because of the continuation of this character over the course of different movies and the kitsch factor of the murderous doll, who is humorous, manipulative, but has likable and dislikable traits. Also, there are friendships, family, and gender dynamics that the film series has explored and is continuing to explore with this new series. So to quote Mancini, he says, "One of my favorite dialogue exchanges in the show is when Chucky is reading Jake's diary. Jake is our main character who is in high school. He's being bullied. He's struggling with his sexuality, and he finds Chucky at a yard sale. And he's going to use Chucky to make like a creepy art project, and then he changes his mind," which I think is like key to the plot. Chucky says to Jake, quote, "You should just call it Devin, Devin, Devin." And Jake is embarrassed. So Chucky says, "You know, I have a queer kid." And Jake is like, "What? And you're cool with it?" And Chucky says, "Well, I'm not a monster, Jake." I like to think that over the years and the films that we've brought dimension to, Chucky, in a somewhat unusual way, I mean, we've seen his home life, his family life, his difficult marriage, and he had a gender fluid child, and he struggled with that in the seed of Chucky, but at the end came to accept it. So, you know, he's a sort of in a good position to become Jake's seemingly ally in that way because he's not a bigot. He's not homophobic. He's not racist. He's just a psychopath who doesn't discriminate. He'll kill anybody. So I wanted to talk about this new development because Chucky is such a huge franchise and it has such a dedicated following that it does hit all these factors that we talked about last week, that I was kind of kicking myself that I actually didn't bring it up. So you can watch this new series, which is called Just Chucky, and it's showing on Sci-Fi and USA Network. So Bianca, you've never seen any of the Chuckies, never seen like a scene from it or nothing?
Chucky, I think, used to play on TV. Like, I think Chucky was kind of one of those TV movies because, again, like, we didn't have cable. And so I feel like I remember, like, watching scenes from it. But, like, so Chucky's the doll is married?
So there's, like, another Chucky movie that's that's called like The Bride of Chucky, and then there's one with his like son, and it's like The Seed of Chucky. So yeah, it like through these like dolls you like explore Chucky's like family dynamics. And then in this like comeback series, a big part of it, I don't know which Chucky was the last movie, but apparently our director had teased that there was going to be more to come, and he did kind of tease this series. So this also has been kind of a long time waiting for some people, but one of the things that we are promised is also these beloved like doll characters to also come back in the series too.
Okay, have you seen them?
I've seen like bits and pieces of them. Like I feel as though Chucky was one of those movies that was kind of always playing on TV all the time. Yeah. And it was one of those things where even though I was super freaked out as a kid, I couldn't look away. Like same thing with that other movie where it's like a creepy Toy Story where the dolls come to life. That movie was always playing on TV.
I don't know what that is.
You know what I'm talking about? Oh my God.
No.
I don't know if that was a kid's movie or not, but I don't know. It felt like it had like a darker vibe to it than Toy Story, but that one creeped me out too.
That's funny.
Anyways, I can't remember, but I kind of wish this new series was a little bit more accessible. I don't have access to either of these things, these platforms, but I would be interested in kind of watching them. I feel as though as an adult, Chucky could be like a cult classic horror movie that me, a scaredy cat, could handle.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think something about his voice, like, I can't.
To me, you know, it's funny because I think his voice is so purposeful in the fact that it's not super creepy. It's more like sarcastic.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like, I don't know. But maybe I'll give it a try. I'm not going to watch it by myself for the first time, so I'll have to wait.
If someone has access to it, or if someone is watching it, let us know, because I was interested in the plot line and how our main character Jake is being bullied by his peers. And so I think my understanding was like Chucky is trying to convince him to essentially like murder or like get his, you know, his bullies back. But then you think like, oh, like Chucky is like his friend, and that's what Chucky does. He befriends you, but then he manipulates you to like do all these like psychopathic things. But then these bullies start to be humanized, and then you're like, oh wait, no, like don't murder people. So I do think that that it's interesting that it's this particular series is taking place with like a younger crowd and a high school dynamic. So it should be interesting if anyone has access to it. Let us know, but I just thought a good kind of art news story to piggyback off of from last week.
Cool. Well, should we get into today's art pop talk? Today, we are so excited to introduce to you my friend Foster W. Krupp. Foster is an emerging museum student and researcher. He graduated from Westchester University in 2021 with a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and minors in Art History and Museum Studies. Currently, Foster is doing a Master's in Public Administration program at Westchester University. His primary research interests are taxidermy, habitat and anthropology dioramas, and museum commercialization, which is so fascinating. I want to hear more about that. Foster will be presenting Salvaging Anthropology Dioramas at the American Anthropological Association annual meeting this November. So we're going to take a little break, and whenever we come back, we will be joined by Foster W. Krupp. Welcome back, everyone. We are now joined by our very special guest this week, Foster W. Krupp. Hello, Foster. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be on the show.
Yay. Can you introduce yourself to the Art Pop Tarts and tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, I'm Foster W. Krupp. I'm a pretty young scholar student. I just graduated from undergrad at Westchester University with my Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology, but then I also minored in Art History and Museum Studies. And then just this fall, I started my master's program, still at Westchester, doing public administration. And I'm hoping to pursue a career in the museum field or museum administration at some point down the line.
So many different things. Foster, you're clearly a person that wears many different hats in the museum world. So we're really excited to have you on today, particularly because this is a subject that I am I have a hard time looking at and analyzing in the visual world because of the creep factor. And I truthfully have a hard time analyzing this work, which is why we need your expertise today. But I'm hoping that you can first off talk to us a little bit about your experience with your research on taxidermy.
Yeah, so my main research focus is definitely taxidermy, particularly in the habitat diorama context. So my earliest memories really are going to the Museum of Natural Sciences in Houston, Texas, and looking at the taxidermy ducks and like wondering how they did it. Like it was just like such a wonderful experience for me, which I know it's not the same for everyone else. I was like, wow, that's so cool. And seeing the animal, frozen forever in time, like it was just a really, it was something I thought about a lot as a kid, and ended up in museum studies and research. And when I was in high school, I kind of knew this was what I wanted to do. So my co-op was working at my local children's museum. So I actually helped them clean taxidermy for in high school, and that was kind of my first like hands-on experience. Working with taxidermists, and then in undergrad, I was a co-curator at the Westchester University Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, and had the great opportunity to co-curate 3 exhibits, 2 of which I got to work with taxidermy and animal specimens.
Wow, that is fantastic. I had known a little bit about your background just on the research side of things, but I didn't know that you have actually been a part of the physical process of what entails taxidermy and how that actually comes about. So that is wild.
Just like hearing about someone else's kind of first memory of a museum too. I feel like Gianna and I just I guess like naturally gravitate toward that art lens, but it's really interesting to actually hear people in a different kind of museum system like talk about their first experience with that other type of museum display and that type of like curation. That is so interesting.
Yeah, I'm a natural history museum guy, so but I love art museums too.
So, I want to talk about the word taxidermy a little bit. Can you tell us, like, does taxidermy literally mean skin art or arrangement? And then how did taxidermy actually come about? It seems like such an unnatural thing, even though it belongs in natural history museums. It feels very weird that things literally frozen like that are so often natural.
Yeah, so the etymology of the word taxidermy is like the arrangement of skin. And taxidermy, from the what we think of when we think of taxidermy, is relatively recent in human history. The age of exploration and colonization. That's when people started to get interested in taking these birds from the New World, bringing them back to their cabinets of curiosity, and kind of keeping them forever, because it's a lot easier to get a dead bird skin over the ocean than an alive bird. So, and because the cabinet of curiosities is kind of our proto museum, one of our proto museums, taxidermy has its kind of roots, intertwined with the museum itself. But taxidermy, I think, is one of the it's part of our conscious a little bit, and not always in like a comfortable way. I think the less museum logical, trophy hunting and that kind of stuff is, what some people think of when they hear that word taxidermy.
Mhm.
So, maybe you're thinking of, Gaston from Beauty and the Beast and his wall of antlers and deer head versus, the habitat dioramas I study.
And it's funny that you bring that up because regards to those different kind of environments like the trophy, I might actually skip to this next question, Bianca, is that taxidermy animals are categorized differently based on their usage or environment. At least that's how I understand them. So a specimen is an exact replica of an animal as it appears in the wild. But as you said, we do have that example of the trophy. That's something for sport. But are there other qualifying categories in which taxidermy is used? I think something in a more like modern context, as you just said, taxidermy is something that is relatively new. And I think through my, basic kind of sense of research, it is something that is being explored in other areas. And something that Bianca and I have looked at is a little bit of death portraiture and how people are, freezing these moments in time for their beloved pets, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct in your research. The idea of the specimen, that's our very museum oriented, idea of taxidermy, and that's maybe where your study skins come into play, where you just have an animal's skin preserved, and you're just stuffing it kind of with stuffing, essentially. But then you kind of have the habitat groups, which is like the American term for like when you have these dioramas that have a taxidermy animal in it, and then you have a background painting, and then you have these artificial foreground elements to kind of create the environment where the animal lives. And that's where Carl Akeley and kind of the modern one of the modern fathers of taxidermy, where he would, rather than just stuffing an animal with stuffing, to have like the shape of an animal, he actually sculpted the veins and muscles of the animal, and created these like under the skin you have like this base where you can put the skin on, and then you have a more realistic looking animal that you can pose in a more dynamic way. So that's kind of the where the museum stops in terms of where the you have, then you go into like the trophies, and definitely pet taxidermy is definitely one of the more interesting sides of it, where you have a lot of people who are very interested in preserving their pet. But with taxidermy, you're not necessarily making 100% accurate reproduction of the living animal. It's almost a caricature. You're trying your very, very best to recreate something that you really can't recreate now that it's dead. And then the other interesting kind of direction of taxidermy, you have these you know anthropomorphized, like Walter Potter's rabbit school, where you're taking real animals and you're putting them in human situations. So he was a British taxidermist, Victorian era, who created these kind of fantasy scenes where he put rabbits in human situations.
Whoa.
And Dr. Seuss with his, he making fake animals with real animal parts. So there's all kinds of different directions taxidermy has gone from just even an art history perspective.
Wow, that's really wild. And it's interesting too that you just the verbiage, I guess, that you're using to talk about it, and like the word specimen, where in art history I'm so used to saying object. And so like I don't know, as I'm thinking about I'm thinking about them as like pieces in a collection. So I have a lot of questions about like how taxidermy is understood through that museum studies lens. And I liked what you were saying too about that sense of like artistry, and that like that idea of like having this out of this sense of like being able to sculpt a body that's not yours, like even if it's an animal body. That's interesting. And like even like thinking about like kind of like modern day mortuary practices, like painting skin and what different people do at funeral homes to like preserve that body and make it look as like lively and realistic as possible. So I think that's like an interesting echo, I guess, to kind of like human death portraiture. But yeah, can you talk about that a little bit more? Like, is it considered an art form? Like, what does the like scientific but historical process look like, or like how are they combined?
Yeah, I think the thing that makes taxidermy interesting is it's both a science and an art at the same time. And you do have kind of this overlap where you're creating a scientific representation of an animal, but you're also creating an artistic representation of an animal. So I think that's why a lot of these, habitat dioramas that, still exist at the American Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum, Los Angeles County Natural History, like there's a lot of these habitat dioramas that are still around, almost 100 or over 100 years later, because there's such like great works of science and art kind of at their best, at this early part of the 20th century when these dioramas and taxidermy in the museum setting really started to emerge. It was kind of before, color photography, color film were, something that people had access to. And, it was before
Mm.
people were necessarily, traveling to parts of Africa, parts of Asia, even parts of the United States where these, big animals and these really awesome natural habitats, still exist. So you have to think like that maybe these people who were visiting, New York History's Natural History Museum, Chicago's Natural History Museum, were maybe not ever going to be at a point in their life where they were going to go to Africa and see a zebra or see a elephant or lion in its natural habitat. So this is the closest that they are ever going to get to experiencing that. So that's this kind of interesting, history scientific lens, but then it's also only possible with the artistry of, these artists who were employed by museums to construct these.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's interesting to like hear you talk about the coming about of taxidermy and how I think so often when we view these, Bianca, I want to say objects too, but when we view these specimens or even these like trophies, even in a museum or historical like setting, even in Oklahoma, I have visited a historical site where it feels very much like I am just looking at a trophy case of taxidermy animals, but you view them in the sense that, oh, like you just said, we have to look at how this was for, people who might have not had the means to travel so they can share it, their experience in these different kind of I don't know, immersive different ways. But to piggyback off of Bianca's question, I really am ignorant to how, especially like natural history museums today, acquire taxidermy animals. Or I mean, and really to hear you say that you've been a part of the taxidermy process under kind of a museum umbrella, I think is really interesting because I'm so ignorant to how do they acquire taxidermy animals, or are they doing the process themselves, or is that something that's still necessary? Like, do we need to keep continuing to taxidermy like animals that we do have the means to travel to go see?
I'm also curious about that like ethical, moral standpoint, like in today's terms, how that relates to Gianna's question. Like as a historian and a museum scientist, like are there different kind of like moral and ethical standards that are in place today as far as practices go?
Yeah, so I mean, with the big museums in the United States, when they first started to develop taxidermy, displays and habitat dioramas and that such, it really was a bunch of old white men getting on a boat, going to Africa, or getting on a plane, going to Africa, and just going wild and shooting a mom and shooting a dad and shooting the children. So you kind of have the whole representation. I mean, that Theodore Roosevelt, went on I think 3 different expeditions for the Smithsonian Institute after his presidency, and was very much involved in New York's expeditions as well with Carl
Mm.
Akeley. And so, I mean, I think one of the things to consider, from the ethical, standpoint is that, it was a different time and people had different attitudes about how the natural world should be protected and preserved. I think a lot of the scientists and artists who are working on taxidermy and natural history museums and exhibits at the time thought that they were doing the right thing because they were bringing a piece of this wild to people who weren't going to see it, and they were also preserving these specimens in the museums at a time when museums were all collecting still actively, which I think a lot of museums, especially natural history museums, aren't necessarily collecting taxidermy specimens anymore. They're just kind of working with what they have. Another avenue is certainly, the illegal wildlife trade. When things get seized by that, they're usually end up in natural history museum collections, to be
Mm.
safeguarded and then potentially also be used in educational context rather than just sitting in government warehouses, being confiscated. But in terms of like, I think that I don't think in now where we are now, especially with climate change and with the deterioration of so many animal species and environments, I don't think it would be ethical to go out and create a new habitat diorama today. If that involves you going and shooting animals, but I think that protecting and preserving the ones we have is important. I think one of the things a lot of people don't realize when they're looking at habitat dioramas, especially, the New York ones that I primarily study, is that they are real places. And, that every single one of these dioramas, is a snapshot of what this, environment looked like, at the beginning of the 20th century. So, at some point they may be our only record of, what it would have looked like for a bunch of zebras and giraffes and Upaki to be, at a watering hole, or, what a bunch of lions in a pride would look like. So I think that's like a scary idea to think about, but it's also, I think, one we have to think about, with the way we are treating the natural world.
Right, right. Because it's like we have these objects. So, like, acknowledging the traumatic history and like how these objects are sourced, but also we have them. So, what's the alternative to just throw them away and to really like disrespect these bodies and these specimens in that way? Might as well learn about them and teach about the whole history. So, that's super interesting.
So, I mean, one of the things that's also important to consider, with this sort of thing with habitat dioramas is this diorama dilemma, where there you have a piece of science, but you also have a piece of art. So you can't really take apart a habitat diorama and take one of the lions out and then just leave the rest, because you have this kind of empty spot. So if you want to get rid of your dioramas, you know that's an ethical and I think a very logical decision for a lot of smaller institutions. But you're also destroying a piece of art too. So there's this kind of museum history, but also this artistic human history as well that's destroyed when you change dioramas and you remove dioramas. So I think that's one of the things that a lot of museums are trying to figure out what to do with them because of the ethical questions they raise.
Yeah, and I think that's a really helpful way to put taxidermy in terms of like the visual world or the art world for our listeners too. We talk about that so much. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of visual artworks that are super problematic or we don't love to learn about, but they need to be preserved because otherwise it's just erasing history. So it's all one and the same. It's a lovely lovely field we are in. But
No, I love that idea of like context, like shifting context for a natural history museum as well. Like obviously Gianna and I talk about that with art objects on the podcast, but like what you were saying with climate change. I mean, I think that is a super fascinating way to recontextualize these like potentially problematic dioramas or like objects or specimens that you have in a collection like that. Like that idea of focusing on climate change is like horrifying, but also I think a really important contextual key that we can use to reevaluate objects like that.
Mhm. So, Foster, I wanted to kind of transition, and you may have listened to one of our earlier episodes for our last ARTloween series, where we did talk about the bodies exhibition and talking about the preservation of human bodies through what's called plastinization. So, I know that the way those bodies are on display, preserving organs, that is like a fundamental difference between plastinization and taxidermy. But again, through my very surface level research and learning about tanning and even how leather is made, I would like our listeners to have a little bit of technical knowledge on the differences between these types of exhibition spaces, but also the differences in the processes as well.
Yeah, I mean, with body worlds and taxidermy animals that you might see at your local museum, I mean, you're exactly correct. Where it's the preservation of organs and like kind of the human internal systems rather than the human external systems, and the skin with your animal and taxidermy. So with taxidermy, you're the parts of the body you can really preserve long periods of time for hundreds of years are the skin and fur and hooves and bones and stuff like that, teeth. But the internal organs are just not something that you're able to preserve chemically like you do with the plasticization, where you're you know essentially transforming the state of matter that the human specimens and the animal specimens too. I think Body Worlds has a horse, right?
Yeah, I think they do have some animals, but this is maybe like a super kind of creepy question, but I think
Yeah.
we're also nearing these questions as we get into the creep factor, but reading so much about the process of taxidermy is essentially the amount of descriptions I read is, the person stretching the skin over the armature. And when I read those descriptions, what it made me think of, because I do listen to like My Favorite Murder podcast, is that serial killer that would like stretch human skin over like
Ooh.
lampshades and would make like
Ooh.
purses or different like objects out of human skin. And it was wild. Like these descriptions feel so normal to read by like anthropologists or by museum studies people or people in the art world, but it really had this like super kind of morbid description that I was taken aback, where I've read those descriptions in other very creepy ways. And this is maybe a dumb question or an ignorant question, but can we know that plastinization is a process, but can human bodies turn into taxidermy bodies? Has a human body ever been on display through taxidermy?
Yeah, this is like the fun whole can of worms you can go into when you study taxidermy, but not very well. I mean, and part of that is because of the technical thing you were talking about with the stretching of human skin. Our skin isn't really, chemically or physically able to stretch and be preserved in a realistic looking way, the way an animal covered in fur can be preserved. And, there's similar other animals that also kind of you have this difficulty with like rhinoceroses and hippopotamuses and the whales. Like people have tried to taxidermy basically anything, but and then human taxidermy is interesting. It's unfortunately not really, it certainly has been done, but most of the times it's been done, from a colonial lens. There was a San man from Africa who was on display at a natural history museum in Spain for until I think 2003. The early
Wow.
2000s, yeah. And the Carnegie Natural History Museum has a pretty kind of famous taxidermy display it was formerly called the Arab Courier Attacked by Lions. And it essentially is a Middle Eastern man on a camel, being attacked by lions. And so for a very long time, scientists have known that, and, museum professionals have known at the Carnegie Museum that the teeth of the man were real, like they were real human teeth. But when they did some X-ray scans to move this thing, they like realized that there's a human skull underneath as well. So there's this interesting like, where did the skull come from? Like, was it collected with these animals while this French taxidermist was in Africa, or was it from a French catacomb? Like, we just don't know the answer to this at this point. But a lot of human taxidermy, is really more limited to kind of mummification and things that don't really classify as taxidermy from a technical standpoint. But it's certainly been attempted, but mostly, you know, to display humans the same way we display animals, which, as an anthropologist, is, I think a difficult conversation that museums are only beginning to scratch the surface of having.
Well, and we've talked about so much about, real life human bodies being on display at world fairs and things like that. So, we think it's even just as horrible to have a real life, human be caged, but to disrespect their remains in that way. And even Bianca and I have talked about our kind of uncomfortable relationship with how, especially when you are traveling to like European historical sites, and how human remains, just bones, are on display. And I know that the Natural History Museum in New York does have human remains in its collection, but I just referring to bones, I believe.
Yeah, I don't think they have anything beyond bones. And I think a lot of their human remains that are kind of still in their collection that haven't been deaccessioned because of NAGPRA are really kind of ancient humans and hominids. So, like, for their evolution hall.
And Foster, I'm not sure that we have talked about NAGPRA too much on the podcast. Would you mind giving our listeners a brief definition of
Oh,
what
yeah, yes.
NAGPRA is?
Yeah, it's the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. It was signed in the 1990s, but basically it gives any federally recognized indigenous group the right and ability to repatriate. I think it's human remains, like objects of very important cultural significance, and any sort of like associated funeral items back into the tribe for kind of what, so that they can kind of do what they want to do with them. And so basically it applies to any institution that receives federal funding. So all the military, any kind of museum that's a federal museum or receives federal funding, and then also universities as well. Yeah, there's this whole kind of thing. I mean, human remains and displaying human remains, where you kind of, with natural history museums, the human remains that are displayed, or that have been displayed in the past, have typically been of Asian and African and indigenous peoples. And there's usually not European cultural halls and natural history museums. Those are usually in history museums. So there's this interesting conversation and ethical thinking that natural history museums have to do with this idea that we're displaying the other, where we display animals and rocks and minerals and space objects, but we're not displaying white people in that same way.
I guess in bringing it into like a modern context and trying to recontextualize that, this, like, the idea of putting humans on display is horrific, of course, but we don't really think about that with animals, I suppose. So I'm wondering if that is coming into a larger light. Can you talk with us about like the creep factor of taxidermy? Because you've talked about that idea of fascination with the exotic and something that you've never seen before, but is it not disturbing, I suppose? And like, is there this idea of like a haunted presence with animals, as there would be in preserving human bodies, or even again, like thinking about trauma and those horrors of putting humans on display? Like, do you feel there's a kind of separation between human and animal worlds within museums?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, I think a lot of, most humans in human society do have different values for humans versus animals. I mean, I think a majority of people consume some sort of animal, and I think that's definitely changing now. But, for a lot of human history, most people were omnivores. So you kind of have to have different values for something that you're consuming versus something that you interact with and are creating, culture and society with. I think in terms of the creep factor, I think there definitely is a little bit of a creep factor, and I think it's definitely people are, I think, have more negative connotations of natural history museums and habitat dioramas than maybe they did in the past. And Rachel Poquin, I wrote a really good book called The Breathless Zoo, where she's talking about how we have this kind of longing for the natural world and animals, and we're kind of using habitat dioramas and taxidermy to, in a kind of selfish way, to kind of understand ourselves more. What is our relationship with the natural world? If it's I think it's becoming more and more of a conflict we have with the natural world, where it's something very colonial and about this manifest destiny that we're the animals and resources are really there for us and to serve us and to help us in different ways. And so I think that habitat dioramas were maybe a little bit of a shift, where it's like look at this mom, dad, and children of an animal, like you have your moose family. And I think that helps people maybe understand that animals are, I don't know. I don't think this makes any sense. Sorry.
It actually does. And it's funny that you talk about the Breathless Zoo and also our modern day zoos, because there are ethical dilemmas with zoos, or especially like privately owned zoos. Like, man, we all went through like the Tiger King phase of the pandemic.
I watched that night. Great through 4 in the morning.
But it is interesting, again, going back to your original contextualization of taxidermies and how those are operating within natural history museums, how those aren't necessarily specimens that those museums are like looking to keep like making. They're just there to kind of maintain those specimens to preserve that. But in a way, zoos are acting as preservation sites for endangered species, and also acting as the same or functioning in the same kind of way to bring attention to animals and have people see those animals who might not have the means to travel to the natural world. So it is interesting how closely they are related, but how they are taking shape differently, of course, versus the living and the non-living.
And museums definitely paid a little catch up with zoos, because I think the zoos in the early, like the mid 50s, really realized like we need to figure out a new way to contextualize ourselves as like people's relationships with zoos were changing. And I think the educational conservational method, I think, is really something that museums have kind of picked up as well, where it's like rather than glorifying taxidermy, I think museums are trying to make sure that people know it's an educational tool, and it helps people to get a more of a sense of like an animal space than just a picture or bones of an animal.
This kind of makes me think of another question. Can you talk about maybe just the working relationship or the professional relationship between natural history museums and zoos? Like, is there a communication or a dialogue taking place between those kinds of institutions?
uh as someone in more natural history, I don't know if I want to speak for zoos, but I mean, I think that there's a little bit of a rivalry, and there's certainly there's this ideas where zoos and natural history museums are, I think, sort of cousins, because they have similar values and similar ideas about what they want the public to get when they go to visit them. But I think they go about it in different ways. You hear stories about like zoos where they'll put like a fake snake in like an exhibit so that people can see the snake, because the snake's always hiding, and then other zoos make fun of them for becoming museums. But
Ooh, zoo
yeah, zoo
drama.
Zoo
drama.
I
tea. I've
love.
never heard of that. That's
I
interesting.
read it in a book a long time ago. Yeah, it's one of those things where I think with the museum, like you're gonna see all the animals you want to see there, whereas I think at a
Yeah.
zoo, you're gonna see whatever animals want to be out that day.
Museums should like rebrand. Like they should like get in like they should like hit the zoos a little harder and be like, yo, you want to see something? It's always out, you know?
And I mean,
Well,
there's
it's just funny for us, again, to think about more like visual works of art and objects. How, as a museum educator in a program, I'm always looking to partner with the next kind of visual institution or gallery. So when we do programs, particularly with other schools, that class can hit our institution and they can hit the next institution, and there's that partnership and that communication between us. So if from a programming standpoint, you go see the Breathless Zoo, and then the next stop is to go to the actual zoo. That in my head, that feels like a logical kind of thing that would take place. But
I'm sure
perhaps
there's
there's
some
more of a rivalry than I anticipated.
I'm sure there's some collaboration out there too. Like I know, like we published this episode, and like some zoo and natural history museum would be like, actually, we've had a working relationship for 10 years now. But I mean, I think there is this idea that when you're going to a natural history museum, you're going to see dead things, and I think when you're
Mhm.
going to a zoo, you're going to see alive things. And so I think that's like kind of connecting back to what we were talking about earlier. If the natural history museums where you see the dead animals and the dead dinosaurs and fossils, that's where you're going to see the dead cultures too. So you have all these cultural groups, represented in natural history museums who are still around today. They've just shifted from what they were pre-Columbian times.
Yeah. Well, Foster, we need to ask, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us about the practice of taxidermy? Are there any kind of fundamental questions that we have missed today? Anything else our listeners should know about?
No, I think we've talked about it, but I think one of the things is just to, I think critically about what how natural history museums can continue to be better, and how taxidermy is always going to be a part of natural history museums, and habitat dioramas as well. But it's kind of like, what do we do to recontextualize them to make sure that they're creating the most value for the amount of space they take up? And I think that's a critical museum question for a lot of museum professionals to wrestle with and emerging museum professionals to grow into.
So we have to ask you one fun question
Oh
before we
yeah,
let you go. And I'm curious, do you love Night at the Museum?
no. No, it's I think it's a really good movie, and I think that's like the thing where it's hard for me because it's like when I was a kid, I was a nerd too about museums and stuff. So I was like, that's not what American Museum of Natural History looks like, Where are the dioramas? That diorama isn't there, So I'm a little bit like that in terms of where it's hard for me to enjoy things where it's like the thing I research.
What about like, I don't know if you're a Friends fan, but Ross in Friends working at the Natural History Museum. I always love like those episodes where he's like doing museum stuff.
I think like
It's
that's where like
so
my
funny.
anthropologist comes out because it's like you're like, oh, you're like Ross, and I'm like, no, he's a paleontologist. We're different. We study humans, not dinosaurs. Big animals.
There's like that episode of Friends where like they all sit at different tables, where like the scientists sit at one table and the guides sit at one table, and then you have gift shop people.
Gift shop. Truly the outcasts of the natural
museum
history
world
museum.
is very segregated. Well, is there anything that you would like to plug before we let you go today?
Yeah, so I've been working on this academic paper for the American Anthropological Association annual meeting. I'm going to be presenting it in November. It's called Salvaging Anthropology Dioramas. And, it's essentially, asking a lot of the same critical questions about, habitat dioramas and taxidermy in the Natural History Museum, but about the anthropology dioramas specifically, which are, essentially the same in terms of like the construction, but rather than taxidermy animals, you're using mannequins and cultural artifacts that you're displaying in a artificial setting with background painting.
That's awesome. You'll have to share with us when it's officially released, or
Yeah.
if we can see your presentation anywhere. That would be awesome.
For sure. I'd definitely love to.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you both.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us and Foster for today's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, all the good platforms. And we will talk to you all next Tuesday for our last ARTloween episode.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Art Pop Talks executive producers are me, Bianca Martucci-Fink.
And me, Gianna Martucci-Fink.
Music and sounds are by Josh Turner, and photography is by Adrian Turner.
And our graphic designer is Sid Hammond.